Lesson first: marriage. After dealing with these points and discussing them in this way to the best of my ability, I am not unaware that the whole question of marriage is still very unclear and complex. I would not be so bold as to claim that I have yet unraveled it fully, either in this work or any other, or even that I could do so now if pressed. St. Augustine, De Conjugis Adulterinis, 125. First, the origin of marriage. Let's start subverting some expectations. Marriage is not about love. Marriage is about sex. Have you ever thought about the origin of marriage? Marriage is one of our oldest institutions, maybe the oldest one. Its origins get lost in the night of times. For us Christians, marriage is a divine institution, a sacred covenant that Yahweh himself established in the beginning. But there was marriage before Christ. There was marriage before Abraham. Marriage is not a Christian invention. When the Spaniards arrived at the New World, rejoining the two portions of mankind that had been separated for millennia, they found marriage here as well. So what is marriage then? What is this institution that we find wherever and whenever we find civilized humans? Marriage is a contract between a man and a woman to establish a permanent partnership, to have sex with each other and raise their offspring together. This is why they call it matrimony. It is the contract that a woman celebrates when she's going to be a mother, in Latin matris. Originally, marriage was an arrangement between a man and a woman. The man promises to protect the woman from dangers and enemies, human or not, and to provide her with resources so that she can raise their offspring. The woman promises not to have intercourse with other men, lest the husband would be raising other men's children with his own resources. It may sound crude, and it probably does not align with your experience. But the truth is that destination weddings of long-term cohabiting couples are a very recent phenomenon. Our Western and postmodern experience of marriage is the fringe one. Marriage was here long before any of the institutions that we know today were even conceived. Men and women have been celebrating this sacred mystery since the dawn of civilization. This is the contract that has kept society together since we had societies. Long before anyone cared about republic or tyranny, about democracy or freedom, since the beginning, we have been making this public promise and creating families. From our experience, marriage may seem like a romantic endeavor. For the immense majority of our fellow human grooms and brides, it was the only way, romantic or not. Societies have arranged, since the dawn of civilization, the business of reproduction, if the expression can be allowed, around these partnerships of man and woman, enforcing monogamy and repressing our most basic instincts. Marriage is the original contract. Maybe it is because of the crisis of marriage that every institution in our world seems to be crumbling down around us. Maybe the end of marriage would mean the end of the world. We don't know, but the end of marriage would certainly mean the end of the world as we know it. Second, history of marriage. There is a famous sentence by St. Augustine about marriage. It's quoted for you at the beginning of this chapter. He says that there is no topic more difficult than marriage. All the areas of knowledge converge in marriage. This is now your task. If you want to help your clients, you really need to understand marriage. Indeed, your mission, shall you choose to accept it, will be to guide the parties in a matrimonial trial, to help them protect their rights. You are going to be a lawyer, so you need to know the law. But you are not going to be any kind of lawyer. You are going to be an advocate, a minister of an ecclesiastical tribunal. So you need to understand the teachings of the Mother Church. You need to live a life worthy of a disciple of Christ, and you need to understand this work as a mission. As an advocate, you are going to be the face of the Mother Church for your clients. The work of an advocate, the work of a lawyer, is mostly an intellectual work. Instead of fighting like savages, we civilized humans solve our disputes by arguing and convincing. In this sense, the future of your clients depends on your understanding of the concepts of this course. If you want to help your brothers and sisters as an advocate, you really need to understand marriage. Unity. Let's start from the beginning. Marriage is a contract between a man and a woman, permanent and open to the procreation of children through sexual intercourse. This contract is celebrated in a public form in all cultures. It is a great celebration, probably the biggest of all parties. The exultation is mixed with the sacred in varied and beautiful traditions all over the world. For the first time, a young man and a young woman are going to have intimate contact. This is a time for celebration and a time for prayer. The future of these two is going to be marked by this day, and they are going to partake in the miracle of reproduction. Weddings are deeply sacred across cultures. Probably this is why contracts are celebrated. You probably noticed the lack of equality between men and women in the original definition of marriage. Indeed, the only one who needs to be faithful in that definition is the woman. Outrageous for our mentality, no doubt. But cruel as it may be, polygamy has been the norm for most of history and still is in many parts of the world. We abhor polygamy, and rightfully so. Polygamy is the degradation of the dignity of the woman who instead of a spouse becomes a slave. Not in vain, in the rite of marriage of the Mozarabic liturgy from Spain, developed under Islamic domination, the priest walks up to the groom and admonishes, "I give you a wife, not a slave. Treat her as Christ loved his church." And yet, we have canonized saints who were polygamists. King David had wives, yes, in plural, and concubines, also in plural. Not only that, when Absalom rebelled against his father David, quote, "They set up a tent on the palace roof where everyone could see it, and Absalom went in and had sex with his father's concubines." Unquote. These were other times, and human dignity was not understood as it is now. In fact, it was the Christian revelation that gave the world the concept of person, which is the basis for all the reflection on human rights and which stems from the theological controversies of the first 5 centuries around the double nature of Christ and the Holy Trinity. The fathers of the Church spoke of the dispensation of the mysteries of salvation to refer to the gradual unveiling of the revelation. God has given His revelation to us step by step, not all at once. This gradual process is very evident with unity and exclusivity of marriage. We understood how important it is in relatively recent times. But in any case, one thing is certain. There was marriage long before there was exclusive marriage. Indissolubility. According to the letter to the Galatians, Christ came in the plenitude of times. It may sound weird to us if we make the mistake of thinking about history as if it started with Christ's birth. But that is not when we arrive to this world. It is just a useful way to count the years. Actually, a couple thousand years is nothing for a species that has been around for several hundred millennia. Jesus Christ really came in the plenitude of times. So, in the plenitude of times, the eternal Word incarnates and teaches us the plenitude of revelation about the marriage contract. According to the Rabbi of Nazareth, divorce is unacceptable. If a man divorces his wife and marries another, he commits adultery. It was a scandal. When Jesus said it for the first time, his own disciples answered that without divorce, marriage is not worth it. And Jesus answered that it was because of the hardness of their hearts, sclerocardia in the Greek Bible, that they were allowed to repudiate their wives. But in the principle, it was not like that. Interesting how this conversation about divorce seems to keep taking place between the Mother Church and her children as the centuries go by. And here is when the notion of indissolubility enters the world. Only death can dissolve a marriage. Marriage is indissoluble. The spouses make the contract, but from then on, it is a sacred bond, bigger than themselves. Once they create it, they are not able to undo it. What God has joined together, no man can put asunder. Notice that Jesus did not forbid divorce for Christians alone. He preaches these tough words for all marriages. Indissolubility is a property of all marriages, sacramental or not. On the other hand, we must take into account that many societies accept divorce in theory, but rarely put it into action. Divorce indeed is frowned upon in all traditional societies, but they all accept that there are exceptional circumstances that make divorce acceptable. Indissolubility is different. It means that divorce is not allowed under any circumstances. If you commit to marriage, you are committing until death, and there is no turning back. Sacramentality. But this is not the only radical innovation introduced by Christ in the very heart of the matrimonial covenant. According to the Catholic Church, the contract of marriage is a holy union, a sacred bond, and for those who are united to Christ in His body, those who are buried and risen with Christ in the waters of holy baptism, marriage is now a sacrament, an efficacious sign of the divine grace that Christ the Lord bled for His bride, the Church, our mother, on Mount Golgotha. Marriage is the seventh sacrament, a very special sacrament, the only sacrament created out of a legal contract. When Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem, marriage already existed. marriage is the only one of the 7 sacraments that existed before the sacraments. There were baptisms, like the baptism of John and the ablutions of the Jews before Christ. The Holy Land is full of baptismal pools. But these baptisms were something different from our baptism. There was thanksgiving and Seder Pesach before the institution of the Eucharist. Melchizedek offered bread and wine, but these things were not our Eucharist. The sacrament of marriage, on the other hand, is the same contract that was celebrated before Christ, the same contract when both spouses are baptized. Sacramentality and indissolubility are linked to each other. The love of God cannot turn back. The gift of His blood on the cross cannot be ungiven. If all marriages are indissoluble, sacramentality adds to marriage a particular firmness. As you will learn later, St. Augustine called indissolubility the good of sacrament, or bonum sacramenti. Make sure that you keep in mind this idea because it is very important. The sacrament of marriage is the contract of marriage itself. There are even 2 established principles in canon law that no canonist worth his salt may dare deny: the principle of inseparability and the principle of identity. The contract is the sacrament, and the sacrament is the contract. The contract cannot exist between 2 baptized without the sacrament, and vice versa. This issue became particularly important for us Catholics as soon as the modern state began to put its hands into our sacramental marriages, pretending to deal with just the contract. The Church has always been adamant that the contract and the sacrament are the same thing. We Catholics believe that some sacraments leave a mark on us, a seal that cannot go away. This happens with baptism, confirmation, and sacred orders. The sacrament of marriage is different because the mark disappears with death. But the same principle applies. The celebration of the sacrament is a source of strength that nourishes the spouses so that they are more and more the image of Christ crucified and His bride, the Church. A very common mistake among practicing Catholics is to believe that marriage as a contract is the civil marriage, and then sacramental marriage is like going a step further. Nothing can be further from the teachings of the Church on marriage. There is but one true marriage. There are no different marriages. There are different conceptions of marriage, of course, but our Catholic conception of marriage is that there is but one true marriage. Consummation. One of the major milestones of our legal tradition was the joining of the Germanic and the Roman notions of marriage. In Germanic law, a contract is in vigor upon the reception of the object. For instance, when I get the cow. In Roman law, a contract is in vigor at the exchange of consents. For instance, when I shake hands with the cow's owner. These 2 traditions had supporters until relatively late in the history of the Church. It was Pope Alexander VI who solved the question, determining that marriage is valid from the exchange of consents, but consummation makes it absolutely indissoluble, to the point that not even the power of the keys can dissolve that bond, because it is both sacramental and consummated. Canonical form. The Council of Trent, at the dawn of the modern era, established a new requirement for the validity of the marriage. Consent must be exchanged in the presence of the pastor or his delegate and at least 2 witnesses. The Catholic Church believes that she has received from the Lord such power over marriage that she is able to regulate who is able to marry. The modern state will copy from this model later on. While this requirement of canonical form appears relatively recently in history, it is going to be very relevant in your work as advocate. 3. Anatomy of marriage. Matrimonial consent. So far, we have seen the main historical milestones that have shaped our notion of marriage. Now, let us approach our subject from a systematic point of view. The first distinction is between marriage as the wedding and marriage as the union of the spouses. Indeed, the word marriage has 2 meanings. A marriage is the celebration of the contract, but also the result of that celebration. In canon law, we call the celebration of marriage matrimonium in fieri, and the partnership of the spouses matrimonium in facto esse, respectively, marriage in becoming and marriage in the fact of being. Marriage is created by the matrimonial consent of the spouses. The only thing that creates a marriage is the exchange of matrimonial consents by the bride and groom, who give each other and receive each other as spouses. This consent cannot be given by anyone else. It cannot be supplied. No one in the world can do it. Not the parents, nor the Pope, nobody. The spouses exchange their mutual agreement to marriage in a celebration that we call a wedding. The wedding, the matrimony in fieri, is the celebration of a contract. A holy contract, but a contract nevertheless. In a contract, 2 parties agree to the exchange of rights and duties, and this precisely is what happens in a wedding. And here we find another common mistake among our fellow Catholics. Quite often, we hear that marriage is not a contract, but a covenant. There are other versions that seem to identify the contract with natural marriage and the covenant with sacramental marriage. This is incorrect and certainly not what the Catholic Church teaches on marriage. A covenant is a contract. Nothing else, nothing more. Covenant means quite literally contract. The word covenant reminds us, of course, of the sacred alliances or contracts that God celebrated with his people throughout the history of salvation. But there is no real difference between the 2 concepts. In a covenant, 2 parties convene in the exchange of rights and duties, exactly like in a contract. In this sense, all marriages, sacramental or not, are sacred covenants, and non-sacramental marriages are contracts. When the spouses issue their respective consents, they give birth to a new reality, a stable partnership. The permanent partnership of marriage now escapes their power. They cannot dissolve what they joined. Marriage, indeed, is a divine institution. This old contract, which we humans have been celebrating since we can remember, was designed by our Creator and is deeply embedded in our natural reason. Spouses do not access the marriage that they want. They either access marriage, true marriage, or they don't. There is but one true marriage designed by God. Matrimonial partnership. And what is this true marriage? We have already described it, But let us now put all the elements together. First, the spouses exchange the right to have sexual intercourse with each other. This right, in Latin jus queundi, is the formal object of marriage, the very heart of the matrimonial covenant. Another classic expression for this is the right to the body, or jus in corpus. Marriage gives the spouses the right to each other's body, which means the right to have sex. Once again, this may sound weird to our postmodern mentality. We are the children or the grandchildren of the sexual revolution of the 1960s. We are used to a world where sex and reproduction have been separated. The sexual revolution is like a pair of glasses that distort our vision and understanding of marriage. Until very recently, the right to have sex included an imminent likelihood of pregnancy. Be mindful of this when you think about marriage. The right to have sex is also exchanged in other types of partnership, like, for instance, in prostitution or concubinage. Marriage is different because the spouses consent to live stably together. They are going to have children and they want to create a stable home where their children can blossom and be raised properly. And this is how we come to the definition of marriage: a permanent partnership between a man and a woman ordered to procreation of children through sexual intercourse. If this is the nature of marriage, then it has two ends: the good of the offspring and the good of the spouses. Marriage is ordered by its very nature to these two goods. First, to procreate and to ensure our most basic instinct of reproduction. And second, to the mutual help and remedy of the concupiscence of the spouses. As you know, we Christians consider sex outside of marriage sinful. On the other hand, when celebrated within the hearth of the matrimonial covenant, sex is not only not sinful, it is a source of heavenly grace. There may be many elements within the two goals of marriage, but the essential content, the peak of each of them, is respectively the conception and gestation of a new human person and the intimate sexual union of husband and wife. These two are the peak and the source from what everything else stems in marriage. This issue of the two ends of marriage was a controversial topic in the past. Traditionally, there was a hierarchy of these two goods. The good of the offspring was considered the main one, and the good of the spouses was considered secondary. But in recent decades, we have been paying more attention to the interpersonal dimension of marriage. After some back and forth, the question was solved by the Pope in the sense that the good of the offspring and the good of the spouses are one double-sided good. And indeed, it is not difficult to understand. The perfect gift of self to each other for the spouses is the perfect communion in the flesh and in the soul of coitus. This undescribable pleasure is the best expression of mutual help and the best remedy of all evil concupiscence. At the same time, the union of the bodies opens the door to creating a new life. The spouses become God-like creatures that bring another human into existence and satiate at the same time their desire to enjoy sexual pleasure and to ensure offspring, to propagate the species, and to live a piece of themselves in this world after they die. Moreover, having happy and loving parents is the best environment for children to be raised. The more we promote love in the family, the more we promote children in general. In sum, the good of the spouses is the good of the children, and vice versa. Case closed. The goods, the properties, the sacrament, and the consummation. St. Augustine further distinguished two goods within the good of the spouses: mutual fidelity and permanence. In his words, there are three goods in marriage: the good of the offspring, bonum prolis, the good of the faith, bonum fide, and the good of sacrament, bonum sacramenti. The good of faith is the commitment to be sexually faithful, which is a sacrifice, but results in a peaceful and nourishing environment. The good of the sacrament is the indissolubility of all marriages, which becomes especially firm with the sacrament. You probably remember from above how these two elements appeared in the history of marriage. Marriage is exclusive and cannot be divorced. The Church has chosen a special name for these two features of unity and indissolubility, the essential properties of marriage. Why the special name? They are essential to marriage because all marriages have them, but they are just properties in the sense that it is possible to marry not knowing them. Most people don't know that marriage is exclusive and indissoluble. This same marriage that we are describing is the sacrament of marriage. Whenever marriage is validly celebrated and both spouses are baptized, that contract is the seventh sacrament. The contract, the exchange of consents itself, becomes a sacrament of the love of God. The sacrament is the wedding, not the partnership resulting from the wedding. And by the way, the wedding is the exchange of consents, not the party afterward. Regardless, the partnership has a permanent mark, a seal that helps the spouses to give themselves to each other. And if the parties baptize after the wedding, the marriage becomes sacramental without a new wedding, at the precise moment when the last spouse is baptized. The marriage becomes sacramental by virtue of the non-sacramental prior wedding. All marriages, sacramental or not, are sacred. Remember this. When the spouses have sex for the first time after the marriage becomes sacramental, when they have consummated the promise of their holy covenant, when they perform the gift of self in the flesh, when there is no rape, no abuse, no unfair coercion, no contraceptive will, but only love, then they seal the deal and tie a knot that only death can dissolve. The Catholic Church believes that she has not received from Jesus Christ the authority to dissolve the sacramental and consummated marriage. All other marriages, indissoluble as they are, may be dissolved by the power of the keys. But this one cannot, because it is a perfect sacrament of the love of Christ crucified. Maybe it was invalid from the beginning, but otherwise it cannot be dissolved. 4. Legislation. What you have read so far is a distilled summary of 2 millennia of Catholic thought on marriage. If there is a contribution of canon law, the law of the Catholic Church, to the legal knowledge of humanity, it is the analysis of marriage. Because it is so central to us, we have thought about it more than anyone else. The course you are starting will navigate the sea of knowledge that our mother has saved for us through the centuries. In this sense, it is important that you feel proud to belong to the operators of the oldest living system of law. Many centuries before any of the countries now existing in the world came to exist, the Holy See had a stable ambassador before the Emperor of Constantinople. Even though we are often forgetful about it, the canonical system of law, the law of the Catholic Church, is the oldest living system of law. We are the deans of the legal world, the closest living relatives of the Roman law. Among the systems of law in the world, we are recognized for our efforts in favor of international peace. That is why the nuncios of the Pope are the deans of the diplomatic corps in many countries. Take pride in belonging to the dean of the systems of law, an originary juridical ordainment. In sharing the bench, in partaking in the same legal universe as Gratian, Gasparri, St. Thomas More, and some of the best legal minds in the history of humanity. Canon law is not a section of the secular laws of your country. We were here first. Against the prepotency of the modern state, the beast who thirsts to dominate every single aspect of our lives, we raise with pride the standard of wisdom of a law rooted in common sense, natural law, and true fairness. A law that is a path, not a wall. We have given to the juridical sciences the concept of subsidiarity. Ultimately, all legislation on personal rights stems from the Christian notion of person. But our biggest contribution to the legal world is the study of marriage. In our legal history, we Catholics have perfected the understanding of this amazing mystery like nobody else, precisely because we believe that it is a sacrament that cannot be dissolved. Catholic authors have written countless books, rivers of ink have run on the matter of marriage, which is so central to our religion. Since the Old Testament, marriage has been God's favorite metaphor to explain his relationship with us. In the Bible, Yahweh is the groom, worshipping other gods is adultery, and sin is called prostitution. The Song of Songs is a collection of Jewish wedding anthems that we read as a metaphor for the union of the Church with Christ and humanity with God. As a sacrament, Christ has entrusted marriage to his Church. Indeed, pretentious as this may seem to many, we believe that the Church is responsible for the sacraments and that marriage is a sacrament. Since the very beginning, since the very preaching of Jesus Christ, the Catholic Church has issued laws and policies concerning marriage. Jesus forbade divorce. St. Paul gave us the Pauline privilege. The councils and popes have issued countless matrimonial laws over the centuries. Now, if we have done our duty correctly so far, you should now be able to understand the laws of the Church on marriage. Please read slowly the following canons. Make sure that you understand everything. If you don't, please go back to the text of the lesson and make sure that you don't quit until you understand everything. The future of your clients may depend on it. Title 7. Marriage. Canon 1055, Paragraph 1. The matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life, and which is ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring, has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament between the baptized. Paragraph 2. For this reason, a valid matrimonial contract cannot exist between the baptized without it being, by that fact, a sacrament. Canon 1056. The essential properties of marriage are unity and indissolubility, which in Christian marriage obtain a special firmness by reason of the sacrament. Canon 1057, paragraph 1. The consent of the parties, legitimately manifested between persons qualified by law, makes marriage. No human power is able to supply this consent. Paragraph 2. Matrimonial consent is an act of the will by which a man and a woman mutually give and accept each other through an irrevocable covenant in order to establish marriage. Canon 1058. All persons who are not prohibited by law can contract marriage. Canon 1059. Even if only one party is Catholic, the marriage of Catholics is governed not only by divine law, but also by canon law, without prejudice to the competence of civil authority concerning the merely civil effects of the same marriage. Canon 1060. Marriage possesses the favor of law. Therefore, in a case of doubt, the validity of a marriage must be upheld until the contrary is proven. Canon 1061, paragraph 1. A valid marriage between the baptized is called ratum tantum if it has not been consummated. It is called ratum et consummatum if the spouses have performed between themselves in a human fashion a conjugal act which is suitable in itself for the procreation of offspring, to which marriage is ordered by its nature and by which the spouses become one flesh. Paragraph 2. After a marriage has been celebrated, if the spouses have lived together, consummation is presumed until the contrary is proven. Paragraph 3. An invalid marriage is called putative if at least one party celebrated it in good faith until both parties become certain of its nullity. If this is your first contact with the canons, welcome to the world of canon law. Canon means law in Greek. Since the beginning, bishops met in councils and issued legislation in the form of canons or rules. The corpus of laws that arose from there received the familiar name of canon law or jus canonicus. You need to become familiar with these canons. The website of the Vatican has available all the legislative texts that you will need as an advocate. Start by saving in your browser the Code of Canon Law, the instruction Dignitas Connubii, and the Motu Proprio Mitis Iudex. They will come in handy in the near future. When we enter into a European cathedral, we are amazed by its size, its beauty, its majesty. How could they do all this? How could the peoples of the Middle Ages rise to the heavens like this? We know the answer. They believed that God was bigger than them. They believed in Jesus Christ and in eternal life. The glory of God was their main goal, so they pursued it. You are about to enter the Cathedral of Matrimonial Canon Law, an intellectual building comparable to St. Vitus of Prague or the Pulchra Leonina. We have an amazing journey ahead of us, but as long as it is clear to you now that marriage is about sex, it is probably enough.